Newport, Rhode Island, July 1956. He walked onto that stage, and the crowd went quiet before he even raised the trumpet. Not polite quiet, not waiting for the show quiet. Something else. The kind of silence a room goes when something is about to happen that cannot be taken back. Louis Armstrong was 55 years old, and for the better part of a decade, the jazz world had been writing his obituary. Not his death, his relevance. The story of what happened at Newport that night begins years earlier, in the back rooms and music columns of a jazz world that had decided it was done with him. By the early 1952, bebop had taken over. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk. Fast, angular, harmonically dense music that demanded you work to keep up. The new critics called it the future. They called everything before it the past, and Louis Armstrong was the past. That was the word used, in print, by people who considered themselves the gatekeepers of what jazz was supposed to be. His music was called simple. His stage presence was called showmanship in the pejorative sense. His grin, his handkerchief, his way of speaking directly to an audience rather than performing above them. Young critics called it pandering. One column published in a New York music journal in 1952 described him as a relic of a more innocent age, charming, but ultimately irrelevant to the art form he helped create. He helped create it. Louis Armstrong, the man who had essentially invented modern jazz phrasing, the man who had taken the trumpet from a band instrument into a solo voice capable of drama, humor, grief, and joy, sometimes within a single bar. The man who had recorded West End Blues in 1928, a performance so harmonically advanced that musicians were still studying it 2 decades later. That man called irrelevant. He read the reviews. People who knew him said he kept the worst ones in a drawer, not to dwell on them. He never explained exactly why. Some people hold on to the thing that hurt them not because it still hurts, but because they refuse to pretend it didn't happen. He came up from nothing. New Orleans, 1901. Born into poverty so complete that working class would have been an elevation. He grew up in a neighborhood called the Battlefield, named for what happened there on Saturday nights. His mother worked as a domestic and sometimes as a prostitute. His father was absent from the beginning. Louis was raised partly by his grandmother, partly by the street, and partly by music, which in New Orleans in the early 1900s was everywhere, unavoidable, the common language of a city that had no other way to hold itself together. He was sent to the colored waifs' home at 12 years old for firing a gun into the air on New Year's Eve. In reform school, they gave him a bugle, then a cornet, then a teacher who saw something. Everything that came after, the Chicago years, the recordings that changed music, the worldwide fame, the decades of performance, everything grew from that bugle in a reform school courtyard. And Louis Armstrong never forgot where he came from, never tried to erase it, never performed as someone he wasn't. That was what the critics called simple. That was what they called irrelevant. The Newport Jazz Festival had been running since 1954. George Wein had built it into the most important jazz event in America. 2 days of music on the Rhode Island waterfront, the names that mattered performing for crowds that cared. In 1956, Louis Armstrong was on the bill. But his placement on the program said everything about where the jazz establishment thought he belonged. Scheduled late in the evening, after the headline acts, in a slot that felt like an afterthought rather than a centerpiece. His manager, Joe Glazer, had pushed for the booking. Armstrong said little about it in the days leading up. Those who traveled with him that summer said he was quieter than usual on the drive north. He sat in the back and looked out the window and did not talk about what was coming. The festival that afternoon had been good, skilled, well received. The crowd was warm in the way jazz festival crowds are when they're watching craft, without yet being struck by something that reaches below craft. Something that gets into the body and doesn't leave. Then Louis Armstrong walked out. He was in his tuxedo, white dinner jacket, black trousers, the white handkerchief folded in the breast pocket. He was already sweating in the July heat. He raised one hand toward the crowd, not a wave exactly, more like an acknowledgement. I see you. I'm here. We're about to do something together. The band kicked in, and what happened over the next 45 minutes is documented on tape because someone had the sense to record that night's performances. You can listen to it now. And what you hear is not nostalgia. What you hear is not sentiment or simplicity or any of the words that had been used to dismiss him. What you hear is a man playing with the authority that only comes from having nothing left to prove, and deciding to prove it anyway. He opened with "When It's Sleepy Time Down South," the song he had used to open nearly every performance for 20 years, a song the critics had cited as evidence of his limitations, sentimental, backwards-looking, the musical equivalent of standing still while the world moved forward. The crowd didn't hear limitations. They heard something true. A jazz journalist named Patricia Whitmore was there that night, covering the festival for a music publication. In her personal notes, not the published review but the notebook she kept for herself, she wrote something that has been quoted in Armstrong biographies ever since. She wrote, "He played the first verse, and I looked around and everyone near me had stopped talking, stopped moving." A woman standing 2 feet away had her hand over her mouth. I didn't understand at first what I was seeing. Then I understood. They were trying not to cry. Patricia Whitmore was not a sentimental writer. Her published reviews were known for precision and a certain controlled distance. She wrote what she saw. Halfway through the set, Armstrong paused between songs. He looked out at the crowd, thousands of people on the waterfront, the evening light coming off the water, and he said something that was partially captured by the microphone. The recording is not clean enough to verify every word, but the people who were there, interviewed separately across different decades, consistently reported the same thing. "I've been waiting to play for you all my life." He said it quietly, not as a performance, more like something that slipped out of a place he didn't usually open in public. Then he lifted the trumpet and played Stardust, and the crowd was gone. Whatever they had carried into that field, their opinions, their arguments, their knowledge of what jazz was supposed to sound like in 1956, all of it dissolved. The reviews that appeared in the weeks after Newport were different from anything that had been written about Louis Armstrong in years. The same publications that had been dismissing him were now reaching for different words. One reviewer, writing for a publication that had called him irrelevant 4 years earlier, wrote, "Whatever one thought before arriving at Newport, Armstrong's performance demands a reconsideration. This is not sentiment speaking. This is the sound of a musician operating at a level that most of us forgot was possible. Forgot was possible. Because that was the truth Newport revealed. Not that Armstrong had suddenly improved, or that the critics had gotten smarter. Something simpler and harder to say. Louis Armstrong had always been doing this. The problem was that a generation had stopped listening carefully enough to hear it. They had heard the handkerchief and the grin and the accessible melodies and decided they already knew what they were listening to. They had categorized him before the first note played. Newport made categorization impossible. You had to hear it as it was. There is a photograph taken backstage after the performance. Armstrong is in a chair, still in the white dinner jacket, the handkerchief now in his hand rather than his pocket, his face completely emptied out. He looks like a man who has crossed a long distance and just now stopped moving. Someone, no one has ever identified who, has a hand resting on his shoulder. Armstrong's eyes are closed. He rarely talked about Newport afterward, not in the triumphant way the moment might have invited. When interviewers brought it up in later years, he would nod, say something brief, Newport was real good, and redirect. He didn't perform his own history for anyone. Joe Glazer told a different story about the drive home that night. He said Armstrong sat in the back and was quiet for a long time, long enough that Glazer wondered if he had fallen asleep. Then Lewis said one thing. They heard it. Glazer said he didn't ask what Lewis meant. He said he understood. Miles Davis, who had been among the most vocal critics of Armstrong's style, who had used language about him that Armstrong's friends said cut deeply, heard the Newport recording. What Davis said about it years later in an interview was brief. He said, Lewis always knew something the rest of us were still trying to figure out. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Louis Armstrong performed for 15 more years after Newport. In 1964, at 63 years old, he knocked the Beatles off the top of the American charts with Hello, Dolly, a record so unlikely that music journalists wrote about it as if they were reporting a natural phenomenon. In 1967, he recorded What a Wonderful World in a single take. The song would outlive everyone in that studio. It still plays somewhere in the world every hour of every day. But the people who were on that Rhode Island waterfront in July 1956, the ones Patricia Whitmore was standing next to, the ones who had their hands over their mouths, the ones who carried something home they couldn't name, those people knew something the recording only partially holds. There was a quality in the air that night, in the space between notes, in the way a crowd of thousands went from audience to witness without being asked. The woman trying not to cry, the critic writing, demands a reconsideration. The man in the white dinner jacket, 55 years old, dismissed, categorized, filed away, saying quietly into a microphone that barely caught it, I've been waiting to play for you all my life. That is what Newport was. Not a comeback, not a vindication, something older than either word. A man playing music the only way he knew how, and a crowd finally hearing it right. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971. He was 69 years old. His trumpet was buried with him. Newport was 15 years before that night, and everyone who heard him on that waterfront carried something home they couldn't quite explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Some things you don't explain. You just remember.